Hello everybody, it's Ben with UpDoc and welcome to the 2021 New Year release edition of the Job Market Pulse. This edition of the Pulse is going to be a little bit different than past editions because we're going to focus specifically on the 2020 data set, just that time window, because we wanted to really address the concerns and the questions about what happened with the job market disruption that we all experienced and what can we look forward to into 2021. There's some really interesting numerically specific data that we'll be talking about, as well as some concerns that we've seen raised really just even this past week about productivity, about corporate culture, and about really the essence of our profession. As always, if you're looking for that spreadsheet, that raw and sorted data, it is there. It's at the very, very bottom of the report. You'll see it when you sign up for it. It'll be emailed directly to you. So without further ado, let's dive right in. There are a handful of really interesting numerical data pieces that are worth talking about. And the first one is kind of a baseline establishment. There's always a difference being in the payment of a physical therapist for their salary and a physical therapist assistant. And you see this trend out with OTs and OTAs, as well as SLPs and SLPAs. And we see this kind of matriculate throughout all of healthcare at large. Now, we're really pleased to share that we yet again have more pharmacists adding their contributions to this data set, and we want to encourage you to continue to spread the word. We really do need a lot more representation from CODAs, specifically SLPs, SLPAs, and really just to flesh out that allied rehab therapy family data set. But back specifically to the PT and the PT assistant, we saw that the PT assistant is paid about 25% less than the evaluating therapist. And this is more or less in tune in kind of this sinusoidal wave of ups and downs between the PT and the PTA. Again, we've noticed this reflected in the other disciplines within allied rehab therapy, but it was worth noting it because it was so well accentuated in the 2020 data set. Next topic is management. How much more does a manager make, whether they be a clinic director or otherwise? And we saw at the line level, at the very least, that the management there is being paid about 16% more than the line staff clinician. The most interesting one to me was that if you were a clinician and you were part of call it a customary practice, say you're in outpatient orthopedics, but you also specialize in something else, another demographic. Maybe it's pelvic health, maybe it's pediatrics, maybe it's neuro and concussion, maybe it's vestibular, whatever the case might be. If you had that, you were paid 13% more than a clinician that just did the primary population for that particular setting or specialty. There's some very real supply chain effects that probably lean into this. Getting a raise of 13% more is kind of a lot. I mean, you're rivaling that of a line staff manager and sometimes into middle management. So what's the deal? More likely than not, what's happening is that clinician there that's able to do maybe dual or maybe triple specialty populations is able to be agile. That clinician can see, say, the ortho population and also fill their schedule with, say, neuro or vestibular or TMJ or maybe wound care. And being able to shuffle these populations around will naturally keep busier, easier than their colleagues that are just, say, outpatient ortho. So really a lesson we've seen with the disruption in 2020 in the job market is that there is a premium in the job market placed to reward those that can be agile in their clinical supply chain. The last numerical bit that's worth talking about is the difference between travel employment versus traditional full-time employment. And we saw this most accentuated in the home health sector. If you're a home health physical therapist and you are a travel clinician, you are making 20% more on average compared to your colleague who is traditionally full-time employed. That's a magnificent difference, a 20% raise for being dispatched as a traveler. So what's the deal? Why this huge difference? Why the premium on the travel dispatch? There are some supply chain effects that we can appreciate. We've seen the data in the job market pulse in past years, but especially in the 2020 data bracket, as well as some input we saw from the practice management report and some hints we've seen also from the corporate quality index. And that is the on-demand need to have a clinician at a difficult to fulfill role. This is nothing necessarily new, but we are seeing a spike in the travel department, if you will, because of the disruption from the pandemic that we saw through 2020. And there's still these ripple effects that are carrying through in 2021. Now, this doesn't mean that we're suggesting that everybody quit their full-time job and all become travelers. travel employment isn't always as consistent. And we saw that too in the home health physical therapist data, where they're getting paid about $1 less an hour. So it's about $2,000 less a year per annum equivalent for being traditionally full-time employed. And so it looks like there's two premiums being paid. There's the premium that, say, a home health agency or an employer is paying for that travel dispatch contract. But we're also seeing that the full-time employee is paying a negative premium. They're getting a slight dock in pay for the promise of more stable work. Moving on, let's talk about productivity. It's that big P word. We've talked about it before here at UpDoc, and everyone talks about it. In this past week, we're talking about the second week of January. There's been a lot of threads on social media and plenty of private messages with concerns about just untenable productivity standards. So we wanted to address that, but we wanted to address it with data. Earlier in the middle of last year in 2020, we released the Physical Therapy and Allied Rehab Productivity Report. So you can reference that for some real numbers dropped by your colleagues, just as you can rely on this data set in the Job Market Pulse. But we wanted to address productivity from a different angle, from a corporate quality angle. The biggest concern coming out of the workforce is that untenable, unrealistic, unachievable productivity standards will ultimately burn out clinicians. And from our perspective here, doing these industry reports, our concern is we're going to create a vicious cycle where we have a very short tenure to turnover across the industry at large for all the various employers and also all the various settings. We're going to lose our clinicians to burnout. A certain percentage of them will eventually leave the industry at large. And what will happen is you'll have a lot more expensive on-demand travel dispatch type jobs open up, which don't solve any kind of long-term problem. And the long-term problem really isn't in production, it's in production value. We saw this in the Corporate Quality Index, where over 75% of the workforce respondents said they just couldn't in good faith recommend their employer organization based solely on the ability of the employer to manage, detect, performance up, coach up, or maybe just let go mediocre performers. But what does mediocrity and all of that have to do with production value and productivity at large? And what it really does have to do with is that most employers, unfortunately and unintentionally, have a very high tolerance to mediocrity because there's no process nor systems in place to detect for them and properly manage them. We've seen this narrative play out in our talent acquisition report as well as in our practice management report, where there's a lot of high performers, but they're being brought down system-wide by maybe a small group of those that like to kind of fly under the radar. So what you'll probably hear, or maybe not hear from your employees, is something like this. So why should I bust my butt any further? Picking up evals, picking up treatments from other people's schedules, and documenting at home off the clock. Not that anybody does that, right? That goes completely contrary to most labor laws. When so-and-so over there is sliding under the radar, doing bare minimum work, shopping online while they're in the documentation room, not rocking the boat, and then getting rewarded for that. And yes, unfortunately, that is real input from your colleagues, from your workforce. So what's the productivity solution? In this edition of the Job Market Pulse release, we go into it a little bit and suggest a couple of turnkey activities that you can implement with your workforce, your line management, and honestly, all tiers of managers to get on board in a collaborative fashion that really addresses the problem. It's production value. It's the fact that there are, unfortunately, some groups along that bell curve that are bringing down the team. They need attention, they need coaching, some of them might just need to be let go. And we also need to recognize and reward those that are ultra high performers that sometimes get in a little bit of trouble because they are rocking the boat. But it's only by rocking the boat that you can change direction and make some meaningful change. It all comes down to matching productivity with transparency and the workplace culture with meaningful performance management. This is the only way that organizations can create objective change across the entire spectrum of who is high or low performing. It also gives input at all levels of the workforce, which creates a better and more united front as we treat our patients. There's a lot more we talk about in this edition, so go ahead and sign up for the report. You'll get it emailed to you. Again, in that PDF, you scroll way down to the bottom, we actually linked all of our legacy data of recent relevance, all the raw data sheets, the actual reports, and of course, this 2020 bracket of raw and sorted data where you can sort for your discipline, your specialty, your setting, experience factors, state, and even as specific as zip code. So pretty cool. The team at UpDoc wants to thank everyone who has participated in the Pulse, contributing your data, as well as spreading the word and spreading this movement to improve the wage literacy and wage transparency for our industry. Thanks for joining me for this one. I hope you enjoy the report. Looking forward to your feedback and your input. I'm Ben Fung with UpDoc, and I will see you at the next one.